In 1897, Queen Victoria celebrated her Diamond Jubilee. Sigmund Freud began his research in psychoanalysis, and Irish novelist Abraham Bram Stoker unleashed one of his most famous horror novels, Dracula. Dracula wasn't the first vampire story ever created. In the stormy summer in 1816 in Geneva, Switzerland, 3 young writers, Lord Byron, Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, and her soon-to-be husband Percy Shelley, decided on a writing contest. The young Mary would write a story of a doctor who creates a monster out of human body parts, and giving it life only for it to destroy him. The result was Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. Lord Byron, on the other hand, came up with the idea of an aristocrat of an ancient family who traveled with an old acquaintance to Turkey, ultimately dying in a graveyard after promising to come back from the dead 1 month later. The story itself remained unfinished until John William Polidori, Byron's physician, resurrected the story 3 years later. Polidori rewrote, embellished, and published it anonymously and without the consent of Byron, under the title of The Vampire. The Vampire inspired several plays and operas in later years. Abraham Bram Stoker was born in Dublin, Ireland in 1847, a time when a penny dreadful novel continued the craze for vampire stories. Varney the Vampire introduced the idea of a European count and the sexual overtones in the initiation of the victim once she is bitten by the vampire. 40 years later, Stoker, now a business partner of actor-manager of the Royal Lyceum Theatre, Sir Henry Irving, began to experience terrors within the theater of his mind. It is said that Stoker had suffered a nightmare of the 3 witches from Macbeth, metamorphosizing into voluptuous vampire women who proceeded to kiss him not on the lips, but the throat, only to be interrupted by the Count barging in saying, "This man is mine, he belongs to me." This is indicated in the working notes which are on display at the Rosenbach Library in Philadelphia. It took 6 years for Stoker to write his book. It should be noted that Stoker never visited Transylvania in his lifetime. Stoker frequently vacationed to the small town of Whitby. It was in Whitby where Stoker came across the account of a Transylvanian prince named Vlad Tepes, which means the Impaler, after his favorite method of execution, though he was sometimes known as Dracula, which means either devil, son of the devil, or son of the dragon. Following the book's publication in 1897, Stoker had wanted to dramatize Dracula for the Lyceum stage for it to be played by his employer, Sir Henry Irving, who had a knack for playing villains, but all it ended up was a stage reading which took 5 hours to get through entirely. Irving summed up his feelings on the project in one word: dreadful. Bram Stoker died in April 20th of 1912, the same month and year of the sinking of the RMS Titanic. The first Dracula film ever made was a Hungarian film called Dracula's Death, now a lost film. But in 1922, German director Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau directed the first adaptation of Bram Stoker's book. However, the company which made the film was unable to get the rights from Stoker's widow, Florence, so the character was called Count Orlok and the title of the film changed to Nosferatu, a symphony of horror. Today, Nosferatu is considered to be a classic film and a prime example of German expressionist cinema. However, due to the fact that the filmmakers made the film without clearing the rights to the novel, Florence Stoker, the author's widow, was able to convince the German courts of plagiarism, and the court ordered all copies of the film to be destroyed. Fortunately, some copies did survive, and 100 years later, we're still talking about it. In 1924, British actor and writer Hamilton Deane mounted a production in London starring Raymond Huntley. It was only a matter of time before Broadway beckoned. The producer, Horace Liveright, was concerned about the Britishness of the language in the play's script, so he turned to writer and journalist John L. Balderston to do a rewrite. With a tight budget, all the parts were cast, including Edward Van Sloan as Professor Van Helsing and Herbert Bunston as Dr. Seward. Only the titular role of Count Dracula was yet to be cast. Raymond Huntley balked at the proposed salary. That's when a young Hungarian expatriate named Bela Lugosi came into the picture. Dracula opened on Broadway in 1927 and was a major success. Carl Laemmle Jr., the son of Universal Studios founder Carl Laemmle, after being given the studio as a 21st birthday present from his father, was the one responsible for bringing Dracula to Hollywood, much to the disapproval of his father. However, when Universal bought the rights to the Dracula novel and stage play, it was intended for the film to be directed by Todd Browning and to star Man of a Thousand Faces Lon Chaney, after becoming immortalized as Quasimodo in 1923's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and as the deformed music master in 1925's The Phantom of the Opera for Universal. But Chaney was under contract with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, and on top of that, Chaney was stricken with throat cancer and died at the age of 47 in 1930. With Chaney dead, other actors were considered. Bela Lugosi had to basically fight to secure the role. So the studio decided to bite the bullet and cast Lugosi in the role he immortalized on the Broadway stage.
I am Dracula.
Now, thanks to the success of this film, which was released 2 days before Valentine's Day of 1931, anyone who is asked to talk like Dracula talks like a Hungarian trying to speak English phonetically.
The spider spinning his web for the unwary fly. The blood is the life, Mr. Renfield.
What must be distinctly understood about Lugosi is that he only played Dracula on screen twice. First in the 1931 Todd Browning film, the second in the 1948 supernatural comedy Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. He played an actor posing as a vampire in the 1935 Todd Browning film Mark of the Vampire, a remake of a now-lost Lon Chaney film called London After Midnight, and played a vampire brought back to life during a Nazi bombing in a film called The Return of the Vampire. Lon Chaney Jr. played Count Alucard, Dracula spelled backwards, in Son of Dracula, and John Carradine played the Count in House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula. Sir Christopher Lee played Dracula for the British film company Hammer beginning in 1958. Dracula was revived on Broadway in 1977 with Frank Langella, and he immortalized his performance in John Badham's romanticized remake in 1979.
You fools. Do you think with your crosses and your wafers you can destroy me? Me! You do not know how many men have come against me. I am the king of my kind.
Other actors include Louis Jourdain, Denham Elliott, and Jack Palance. Actress Winona Ryder was at first slated to play the role of Mary, daughter of Michael Corleone, in the third Godfather film for director Francis Ford Coppola. Ryder would fall ill and drop out before shooting was to begin, leaving Francis with no other alternative but to cast his young, inexperienced daughter Sophia. Coppola eventually forgave Ryder for dropping out, and in response, she gave Coppola the screenplay of Dracula, written by James V. Hart, writer of Steven Spielberg's Hook. With many versions of Dracula on film, almost none of them have done a faithful adaptation of the book. For the role of Dracula, Coppola chose British actor Gary Oldman, famous for his performance in Sid and Nancy and JFK. Winona Ryder was already pegged for the role of Mina. Fresh from winning his Oscar for The Silence of the Lambs, Sir Anthony Hopkins was selected to play Professor Van Helsing. For the part of Jonathan Harker, Coppola wanted a young, hot star in order to attract the female audience. Keanu Reeves was best known for Bill and Ted. Reeves was, at the time, exhausted from completing several films after signing on as Jonathan Harker, and tried to raise his energy up, but, quote, "I just didn't have anything left to give," end quote. Other actors include Cary Elwes, Billy Campbell, Richard E. Grant, and Sadie Frost. Before filming began, Coppola had assembled his cast at his winery up in Napa, California, for something called Camp Coppola. These activities include reading the book from beginning to end, theater games, rehearsals, and developing a camaraderie. Production of the film was mostly done at Sony Pictures Studio and the back lot at Universal Pictures. It was Coppola's decision to make the costumes the sets, meaning all attention and care would be put into the bizarre, outlandish costumes designed by Japanese designer Eko Ishioka. Coppola did cross swords with the film's first production designer, Dante Ferretti, and was replaced with Hook's production designer, Tom Sanders. The cinematographer was Michael Ballhaus, a frequent collaborator of Martin Scorsese, having photographed After Hours, The Color of Money, The Last Temptation of Christ, Goodfellas, The Age of Innocence, Gangs of New York, and The Departed. The makeup effects were accomplished by Greg Kenham, known for doing great old age makeups. Here, he managed to create so many different variations of Dracula, both human and beast, young and old. The visual effects of the film were mostly done in camera, without a single computer-generated shot in the entire film. Coppola wanted to use effects that were done in the earliest days of cinema, and not rely on CGI. The effects were supervised by his son, Roman. To compose the score, Coppola hired Polish composer Wojciech Kilar. Kilar wrote 3 different themes and then played them in different instrumentations and created a complete score. A teaser trailer had been playing in theaters, but was demanded its removal for being too extreme. All it was blood forming the film's title. There are 2 reasons for this film being called Bram Stoker's Dracula. First, in order to avoid any legal action from Universal Pictures, who had made many Dracula films, but more appropriately because Francis Ford Coppola has a knack for giving the author top billing over the title, just as he did with all 3 Godfathers and later The Rainmaker. But at any rate, Bram Stoker's Dracula was released on November 13th, 1992, to positive reviews and $260 million worldwide on a $40 million budget. At the 1993 Academy Awards ceremony, Dracula won 3 out of 4 Academy Awards for makeup, sound effects editing, and costume design. The success of both The Godfather Part 3 and Bram Stoker's Dracula saved Francis Ford Coppola's American Zoetrope from going bankrupt. The first time I've heard about Bram Stoker's Dracula was when I saw the poster and thought it was so striking. I obviously was aware of the 1931 Bela Lugosi version and wondered how this film would be different from that film. Unfortunately, I was too young when the film first came out and wasn't allowed to see it. Later on, I discovered that the film was directed by Francis Ford Coppola, the same guy who gave us the Godfather saga. It didn't seem like the kind of movie that you would expect from someone like Coppola, but when I finally saw the film when it was shown on TV, I was captivated by the outstanding visuals and how Coppola didn't use a single computer-generated effect in the entire film. And I thought that the cast did a marvelous job. Well, almost. Gary Oldman is my generation's man of 1,000 faces, and it shows in a lot of his other performances. Winona Ryder can really break my heart just by speaking, and of course Sir Anthony Hopkins, who has never made a bad performance, and holds your attention whenever he's on screen. So in closing, Bram Stoker's Dracula, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, is such a visually appealing film, and that took Bram Stoker's piece of gothic literature and brought it to a contemporary audience in a stunning way. The performances keep you intrigued, the costumes are both beautiful and bizarre, and the visuals make it such a unique take on a classic tale. It might not be 100% exactly like the book, but for me, this is as close as we're gonna get. It is, next to the Godfather saga and Apocalypse Now, Francis Ford Coppola's best work.